The stagecoach rattled into Kearney, Nebraska on a blistering July afternoon in 1878, carrying a woman who kept her head down and her hands folded tightly in her lap. Fingers pressed against the high collar of her worn traveling dress despite the oppressive heat. Rebecca Watson had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, each mile taking her further from the ashes of her old life and closer to an uncertain future with a man she had never met. The advertisement had been simple enough: rancher seeking wife. Must be of good character and willing to work. No need for beauty. That last line had sealed her decision. She pressed her gloved fingers against her throat, feeling the ridged flesh beneath the fabric, and whispered a prayer that Preston Young would be a man of his word. The driver called out their arrival, and Rebecca's stomach twisted with anxiety. She had sent only one photograph, taken years ago before the fire, before everything had changed. In her letters, she had been honest about her situation, or as honest as shame and fear would allow. She had written that she bore scars from an accident, that her appearance had been altered, that she understood if he wished to reconsider their arrangement. His response had been brief: "I am not looking for perfection, Miss Watson. I am looking for a partner. If you can accept a simple life on a cattle ranch, then I can accept whatever you bring with you." Those words had given her hope, fragile as a bird's egg, and she had clung to it through the long journey west. Now, as the stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the general store, that hope felt more like terror. The driver opened the door and offered his hand. Rebecca descended carefully, her legs unsteady after hours of travel. The main street of Kearney stretched before her, a wide dirt road lined with wooden buildings that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon heat. A few townspeople glanced her way with casual curiosity before returning to their business. She kept her head lowered, the wide brim of her bonnet casting shadows across her face. "Miss Watson." A deep voice spoke from somewhere to her left. Rebecca turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man standing a respectful distance away was tall and lean, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard physical labor. He wore dusty work clothes and a hat that had seen better days. His face was weathered and tanned from years under the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he was somewhere in his early 30s. Those eyes were a startling blue, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Mr. Young." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. He nodded and took a step closer, removing his hat. "I am. I hope your journey was not too difficult." His gaze remained steady on her face, or what he could see of it beneath the bonnet. "It was long, but I managed well enough." Rebecca's hands trembled as she clasped them together. "I must thank you for your patience in corresponding with me, and for your willingness to proceed with our arrangement despite my circumstances." Preston frowned slightly. "Your circumstances?" "Yes, I wrote to you about the accident, about the scars." She could barely force the words out. Even now, after 3 years, speaking of it felt like swallowing glass. Recognition dawned in his expression, followed immediately by concern. "Miss Watson, I received all your letters. I thought I made my position clear. Whatever difficulties you have faced do not change our agreement unless you have changed your mind." "No, I have not changed my mind." Rebecca lifted her chin slightly, gathering what little courage remained to her. "But I think it only fair that you see what you are getting before we proceed to the church. I will not have you bound to me through trickery or deception." Preston looked around at the handful of people moving along the street, then gestured toward a quiet space beside the general store. "Would you prefer to speak more privately?" Rebecca nodded and followed him, acutely aware of the stagecoach driver unloading her trunk behind them. When they stood in the shade of the building, away from curious eyes, She finally raised her head and looked directly at him for the first time. His expression did not change. He simply looked at her, waiting with shaking fingers. Rebecca reached up and untied the ribbon beneath her chin. She removed her bonnet slowly, then reached for the high collar of her dress. She had sewn it herself, designed to cover as much as possible, but now she carefully folded the fabric down to reveal what she had been hiding. The scars ran from her left jaw down her neck and disappeared beneath her collar. The fire had marked her with twisted, angry flesh, leaving her skin mottled and discolored. Her left ear had been partially damaged, and the scars continued up the side of her face, pulling slightly at the corner of her mouth. She had been told by more than one person that she looked monstrous, that no decent man would ever want her now. Her former fiancé had broken their engagement within days of seeing her after the bandages came off. Rebecca stood perfectly still, holding her breath, waiting for Preston to recoil or make his excuses. She had prepared herself for rejection so many times that it had become almost routine. Preston stepped closer instead. He studied her face carefully, his blue eyes tracing the path of the scars with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, refusing to show more weakness than she already had. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "A fire. 3 years ago. I was working as a teacher at a school in Philadelphia. One of the students accidentally knocked over an oil lamp during the winter, and the whole room caught fire. I managed to get most of the children out, but the doorway collapsed. The burns were extensive." Rebecca's voice remained steady, though her hands still trembled. "I was told I was fortunate to survive. You saved the children. Yes, all but one little girl who had already succumbed to smoke before I could reach her." The memory still haunted her dreams. Her name was Sarah. She was 7 years old. Preston's expression softened with something that looked almost like admiration. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and traced one finger very gently along the edge of a scar on her jaw. His touch was feather-light and surprisingly warm. "I see only beauty here," he said simply. "Beauty and courage and sacrifice. Any man who could not see that is a fool." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She had expected pity at best, revulsion at worst. She had not expected this. "You truly mean that?" "I do not say things I do not mean, Miss Watson. I asked for a wife who could be a partner, someone with strength and character. You crossed half the country alone to start a new life. You bear the marks of saving children at great cost to yourself. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." He stepped back and settled his hat back on his head. "Now, if you are still willing, we have an appointment with the preacher, but I will not hold you to any obligation if you have doubts. You are free to take time to decide, or to return to Philadelphia if you prefer. I will pay your fare either way." Rebecca stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception or false charity. She found only patience and sincerity. Something tight and painful in her chest began to loosen. "I have no desire to return to Philadelphia. There is nothing for me there. But Mr. Young, you should understand that these scars are not just on my face. They cover much of my left side. I am not the woman in the photograph I sent you. I understand. And I am not a romantic man, Miss Watson. I will not fill your head with pretty words or false promises. What I can offer you is a home, respect, and a partner's share in everything I have built. The ranch is not large, but it is mine, free and clear. I run about 200 head of cattle with the help of 2 hired men. The work is hard but honest. If you can accept that, then we have the foundation for a decent marriage." Rebecca thought of the boarding house where she had been staying in Philadelphia, the pitying looks from the landlady, the way children sometimes cried when they saw her face. She thought of the endless, lonely years stretching ahead of her, always hiding, always ashamed. I can accept that, she said. I am not afraid of hard work, and I have no illusions about romance. A partnership built on honesty and respect sounds more valuable than poetry anyway. Preston's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Then let us go meet Reverend Michaels. He is expecting us at 4 o'clock. They returned to the main street where Preston retrieved Rebecca's trunk, hefting it easily onto his shoulder, and they began walking toward the small white church at the end of town. Rebecca kept her bonnet in her hand, her head up despite the stares from a few townspeople. If Preston Young could look at her without flinching, she would not hide from anyone else. The church was simple but well-maintained, with a small bell tower and rough wooden pews. Reverend Michaels was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a graying beard. He greeted them warmly and did not react at all to Rebecca's scars, which she appreciated more than she could say. The ceremony was brief and practical, with 2 witnesses pulled from the street to make it legal. Rebecca spoke her vows in a clear voice, feeling both terrified and strangely calm. This was not the wedding she had once imagined for herself, but it was real and honest, and the man standing beside her had looked at her ruined face and called her beautiful. When Preston slipped a simple gold band onto her finger and spoke the words binding them together, Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back, unwilling to break down in front of strangers. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Michaels said with a smile. Preston looked at Rebecca, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and he leaned down to press a chaste kiss to her lips, careful and respectful. It lasted only a moment, but Rebecca felt the warmth of it down to her toes. They signed the marriage certificate, thanked the reverend, and stepped back out into the late afternoon sun as husband and wife. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from here," Preston said as they walked toward the livery stable. "I brought the wagon so you would be comfortable. We will need to stop at the general store first so you can purchase anything you might need. I am afraid the house is not well stocked for a woman's needs." "I have some money saved," Rebecca began, but Preston shook his head. "You are my wife now. What is mine is yours. We will start as we mean to go on, as partners." They spent the next hour at the general store where Rebecca, still adjusting to her new circumstances, selected basic supplies and a few bolts of fabric for making new dresses. Preston added items without consulting her, things like coffee and sugar and salt pork, and a beautiful warm quilt that made Rebecca protest it was too expensive. "Winter comes hard out here," he said firmly. "You will need it." The storekeeper, a friendly woman named Mrs. Patterson, chatted with them about ranch life and offered advice about preserving food and making soap. She treated Rebecca with casual warmth, and if she noticed the scars, she gave no sign of it. By the time they finished loading the wagon, Rebecca felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The ride to the ranch took them west out of town, following a well-worn road that eventually gave way to open prairie. The landscape was vast and empty in a way that made Rebecca's breath catch. She had lived her whole life in Philadelphia, surrounded by buildings and people and noise. Here, the sky seemed to go on forever, an endless blue dome broken only by the occasional cloud. The grass rippled in the wind like waves on an ocean, and the only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "I have never seen so much open space." "It can be lonely," Preston admitted. "The nearest neighbor is 5 miles south, but I find I prefer the quiet. Too many people makes me feel crowded." "I think I understand that. After the fire, I could not bear being in crowded places anymore." Everyone staring, whispering. "At least here there is room to breathe." Preston glanced at her. "You will not have to hide here, Rebecca. On the ranch, it is just us and the men who work for me, and they are good fellows who will treat you with respect or answer to me." The use of her first name sent a little thrill through her. "Thank you, and please call me Rebecca always. I think we can dispense with formality given the circumstances. Rebecca it is, and you should call me Preston." The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon when Preston guided the wagon off the main road onto a narrower track. After another 20 minutes, buildings appeared in the distance. The ranch was modest, consisting of a main house, a barn, a stable, and a few smaller outbuildings. A corral held several horses, and Rebecca could see cattle grazing in the distance. Preston pulled the wagon up in front of the house and set the brake. "It is not fancy," he said, and for the first time Rebecca heard something like uncertainty in his voice. "But it is solid. I built most of it myself over the past 8 years." Rebecca studied the house. It was a simple rectangular structure made of wood with a covered porch across the front. Shutters framed the windows and the roof looked sturdy. It was more than she had expected, honestly. More than she felt she deserved. "It looks like a good home," she said. "Strong and well made." Some of the tension left Preston's shoulders. He climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her down, his hands careful on her waist. Rebecca felt suddenly shy, aware that they were man and wife now, that they would be sharing this house, sharing a life. 2 men emerged from the barn, both young and sunburned. Preston introduced them as his hired hands, Tommy Brennan and Samuel Cole. Both men were polite, greeting Rebecca with respectful nods and welcome smiles. If they noticed her scars, they hid it well. "We will get your trunk inside," Preston said. "Tommy, Samuel, would you unload the supplies from the wagon and see to the horses?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Young," Tommy said cheerfully. He was perhaps 20, with red hair and freckles. "Welcome to the ranch, Mrs. Young." Mrs. Young. Rebecca was not sure she would ever get used to that. Preston carried her trunk easily, shouldering open the front door and gesturing for her to enter first. Rebecca stepped over the threshold into her new home, her heart racing. The interior was simple but clean. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a black iron stove in one corner, a sturdy table with chairs, and a pair of worn but comfortable-looking armchairs near the fireplace. Shelves lined one wall, holding dishes and supplies. Everything was neat and organized in a way that suggested Preston took care with his possessions. "Bedroom is through there," Preston said, nodding toward a door on the far wall. "There is also a small room I use for storage that could be converted to another bedroom if you prefer separate sleeping arrangements. I will leave that decision to you." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. She had not allowed herself to think too carefully about the intimate aspects of marriage. "I believe married couples should share a bedroom," she said quietly, "unless you would prefer otherwise. I am content to share, but I want you to be comfortable. We do not need to rush into anything. We are strangers yet, for all that we are married now." His consideration touched her deeply. Rebecca set down her small traveling bag and looked around the room, trying to imagine herself living here, building a life in this place. "Perhaps you could show me the rest of the house." Preston gave a brief tour. The bedroom was small but sufficient, with a large bed covered by a simple quilt, a wardrobe, and a washstand. The storage room was indeed small, filled with tools and supplies. Outside, he showed her the well, the root cellar, and the chicken coop. "I am afraid I am not much of a cook," he admitted as they returned to the house. "I usually make simple meals, beans and bacon and such. If you know how to cook, I will not complain about better food, but I do not expect you to wait on me." "I can cook," Rebecca assured him. "Nothing fancy, but good solid meals. I would be happy to take over the cooking. It will give me something useful to do." They spent the rest of the evening in awkward domesticity. Rebecca prepared a simple supper from the supplies while Preston tended to ranch business. They ate together at the table, making stilted conversation about the ranch, the weather, the town. It felt strange and formal, but not unpleasant. As darkness fell, Preston lit the lamps and banked the fire in the stove. Rebecca washed the dishes, hyper-aware of every movement, every sound. The weight of the gold band on her finger felt strange and new. Finally, there was nothing left to do but retire for the night. In the bedroom, Rebecca unpacked her nightgown with trembling hands. Preston busied himself with checking the window latches, giving her privacy to change. She slipped behind the privacy screen in the corner and changed quickly, braiding her hair over one shoulder. The nightgown had a high collar like all her clothes, covering the worst of the scars. When she emerged, Preston had changed into simple sleeping clothes and was turning down the bed. He looked at her, and something in his expression made her feel less afraid. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her. "We do not need to rush. We are married and we have time to know each other." Rebecca nodded, grateful beyond words. They climbed into bed from opposite sides and Preston extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, Rebecca lay rigid, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night. The wind whispered across the prairie, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. "Rebecca." Preston's voice came soft in the darkness. "Yes, I am glad you came. I think we will do well together." Something warm bloomed in Rebecca's chest. "I think so too." She fell asleep listening to his steady breathing, and for the first time in 3 years she did not dream of fire. The next morning, Rebecca woke to find Preston already gone from the bed. Pale dawn light filtered through the curtains, and she could hear movement in the main room. She dressed quickly in one of her practical day dresses and braided her hair, then went to investigate. Preston was at the stove attempting to make coffee. He looked up when she entered and had the grace to look sheepish. "I was trying to let you sleep, but I am afraid I am not quiet. I am an early riser anyway." Rebecca came to the stove and assessed the situation. "Let me help." "Why do you not tell me about the work that needs doing today while I make breakfast?" They fell into an easy routine. Preston described the daily tasks of running the ranch while Rebecca prepared eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits. She found the kitchen well organized if sparsely stocked, and made mental notes about supplies they would need. Tommy and Samuel joined them for breakfast, and the 4 of them ate together at the table. The young men were friendly and talkative, telling Rebecca about the ranch and the area. She learned that they lived in a small bunkhouse behind the barn, that they had both been working for Preston for 2 years, and that they considered him a fair and decent boss. After breakfast, Preston offered to show Rebecca around the ranch properly. They walked together in the morning coolness, and he explained his operation. He ran mostly shorethorn cattle, bred for both beef and dairy. He sold cattle in Kearney twice a year and had built up a good reputation for quality stock. The ranch was small by Nebraska standards, but profitable enough to provide a decent living. "I have been thinking about expanding," he said as they stood by the corral, watching the horses. "Maybe adding another 100 head next year, but that would mean more work, possibly hiring another hand." "Do you think the ranch could support that?" Rebecca asked. "I believe so. Cattle prices have been good the last few years and I have been saving, but it would be a risk." He looked at her. "I told you we are partners. This is your ranch now too. What do you think?" Rebecca was startled by the question. "I do not know enough about ranching to offer an informed opinion." "But you have instincts. You ran a household, managed a classroom. Those skills translate. Do you think we should expand or stay steady?" Rebecca considered carefully. "I think if you have been planning this for a while, and if you believe the market will support it, then you should try." but perhaps not the full 100 head at once. Start smaller, see how it goes. Test the waters before committing fully. Preston's face broke into a genuine smile, the first she had seen from him. It transformed his features, making him look younger and infinitely more approachable. That is good advice. Smart. See, I told you we would work well together. They spent the rest of the morning touring the property. Rebecca met the milk cow, gathered eggs from the chickens, and learned where the different pastures were. It was all new and overwhelming, but also exciting. She had never imagined herself as a rancher's wife, but standing on the porch of the little house looking out over the prairie, she could begin to picture a life here. That afternoon, while Preston and the men worked with the cattle, Rebecca cleaned the house thoroughly and took inventory of their supplies. She made bread and started a stew for supper. It felt good to be useful, to have a purpose again. When Preston came in for supper that evening, dusty and tired, he stopped in the doorway and stared at the table she had set. She had found a tablecloth in the storage room and pressed it, set out the good dishes, and placed a jar of wildflowers in the center. "Rebecca, you did not have to go to this trouble," he said, but he looked pleased. "It was no trouble. I wanted our home to feel welcoming. Our home." The words seemed to settle something between them. They ate together, and the conversation came easier than the night before. Preston told her about a problem with one of the fences, and Rebecca told him about her plans for a vegetable garden. They spoke like two people learning to be friends, and Rebecca thought perhaps that was the best foundation for a marriage anyway. The days developed a rhythm. Rebecca rose early, made breakfast, tended the chickens and the garden she had started. She cooked and cleaned and sewed, and in the afternoons when the heat was too fierce for outdoor work, she sat on the porch and read from Preston's small collection of books. He joined her sometimes, sitting in the other chair, mending tack or carving pieces of wood into useful objects. They talked about everything and nothing, gradually learning each other's histories and dreams. Rebecca learned that Preston had come to Nebraska from Missouri after his father died, looking for land of his own. He had worked as a ranch hand for 5 years, saving every penny before buying this property. He had built the house himself, log by log, and took pride in every inch of it. He was 32 years old, had never been married, and preferred solitude to society. He read poetry when he thought no one was watching, and he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed. Preston learned that Rebecca had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a bookkeeper and a seamstress. She had loved teaching and had hoped to open her own school one day. After the fire, she had been unable to return to teaching because parents objected to her appearance frightening the children. She was 26 years old and loved thunderstorms and honeyed tea and the smell of bread baking. She was stronger than she looked and stubborn when she believed she was right. Week by week, they grew more comfortable together. Preston began to reach for her hand when they walked. Rebecca began to touch his shoulder when she passed behind his chair. The careful distance between them in bed began to shrink until they slept close enough to feel each other's warmth. One evening, about a month after Rebecca's arrival, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Preston had his arm along the back of her chair, and Rebecca had allowed herself to lean slightly against him. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "You said your fiancé broke your engagement after the fire. Do you still have feelings for him?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "No, I thought I loved him, but I think I was in love with the idea of marriage and security. When he left, I was more ashamed than heartbroken. He showed me who he truly was, someone who valued appearance over character. I am grateful now that he left, because it brought me here. Preston's arm moved from the chair to her shoulders, drawing her closer. "I am grateful too. I know this is not a conventional romance, but I want you to know that I have come to care for you deeply. You are exactly the partner I hoped for." Rebecca's heart swelled. She turned to look at him, this good man who had looked at her scars and seen beauty. "I care for you too, Preston, more than I expected to, if I am honest. You have given me back my life." He cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing along her jawline over the ridged scars. Then he leaned down and kissed her, not chastely this time, but with real feeling. Rebecca kissed him back, her hands clutching his shirt, and felt something that had been frozen inside her for 3 long years finally begin to thaw. That night, their marriage became complete in every way. Preston was gentle and patient, taking time to help Rebecca overcome her shyness and fear. He kissed her scars, every single one he could reach, and told her she was beautiful until she almost believed it. And when she lay in his arms afterward, feeling cherished and safe, she realized with wonder that she had somehow fallen in love with this quiet, serious rancher. The summer passed into autumn, and Rebecca settled fully into her new life. She planted a large garden that provided vegetables for their table and to sell in town. She learned to ride and began accompanying Preston around the ranch, learning the work of cattle ranching. She befriended Mrs. Patterson in town and a few other ranch wives, women who accepted her without judgment and welcomed her into their community. Preston proved to be everything he had promised and more. He treated her as a true partner, consulting her on decisions about the ranch and listening to her opinions. He was affectionate in private and respectful in public. He continued to tell her she was beautiful, and slowly, Rebecca began to see herself through his eyes instead of her own shame. In October, they attended a dance in Kearney. Rebecca had been nervous about going, worried about people staring, but Preston had insisted. "You are my wife, and I am proud to have you on my arm. Anyone who has a problem with that can answer to me." Rebecca wore her best dress, deep blue calico with white trim. She left her hair down instead of tightly braided, and she held her head high as they entered the town hall. There were some stares, some whispers, but Preston kept his hand firmly on her waist and introduced her to everyone with such obvious pride that the whispers quickly died. When he led her onto the dance floor, Rebecca felt like she was floating. She had thought she would never dance again, never have a man look at her the way Preston was looking at her, like she was precious and desired. They danced 3 dances, and Rebecca laughed with pure joy. On the ride home, Preston told her he loved her. The words were simple and heartfelt, and Rebecca said them back without hesitation. She did love him, deeply and truly. This man who had seen past her scars to the woman beneath, who had given her a home and a purpose and his heart. Winter came hard and cold, just as Preston had warned. Snow blanketed the prairie, and the temperature dropped below 0. Rebecca was grateful for the warm quilt and for Preston's body heat at night. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other or playing cards or simply talking. The work was harder in winter, keeping the stock fed and watered, making sure pipes did not freeze, but they managed together. On Christmas morning, Preston gave Rebecca a beautiful leather-bound journal. "For your thoughts," he said, "and maybe someday for our children to read." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She had not told him yet, had not been certain until this week. "About that," she said softly. "I believe we will have a child to read it sooner than you think. I am fairly certain I am with child." Preston's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, joy, concern. "Are you certain? Are you well? Should you be doing less work?" Rebecca laughed and took his hands. "I am certain enough. I saw a midwife in town last week to confirm, and I am well, perfectly healthy. Women have been having babies for thousands of years, Preston. I will be fine." He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Rebecca, you have made me happier than I ever thought possible." The winter passed slowly, but Rebecca did not mind. She sewed baby clothes and prepared the storage room as a nursery. Preston fussed over her constantly, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work, which Rebecca found both sweet and exasperating. Her body changed, her belly swelling with their child, and Preston continued to tell her she was beautiful, continued to kiss her scars and hold her tenderly. In early spring, Tommy announced he would be leaving to start his own homestead further west. They held a small party for him, and Preston gave him a generous bonus and 2 young heifers to start his own herd. Samuel agreed to stay on, and they hired a new hand, an older man named George who had years of ranching experience. As Rebecca's time drew near, Preston became increasingly nervous. He rode into town and came back with the midwife, Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, a capable woman in her 50s who agreed to stay at the ranch for the last few weeks of Rebecca's pregnancy. "First babies can come early or late," Mrs. Harrison said practically. "Best to be prepared." Rebecca's labor began on a warm May morning in 1879, nearly 10 months after she had arrived in Kearney. Preston paced the porch frantically while Mrs. Harrison attended Rebecca in the bedroom. Samuel had wisely taken George and ridden out to check the north pasture, giving the women privacy. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night. Rebecca gritted her teeth through the pain, holding tight to Mrs. Harrison's hand. She heard Preston's boots on the porch, back and forth, and loved him even more for his worry. Finally, as the first light of dawn touched the sky, Rebecca's son was born. He came into the world squalling loudly, tiny fists waving, and Rebecca wept with joy and relief as Mrs. Harrison placed him in her arms. Preston burst through the door before anyone could tell him to enter. He stopped dead at the sight of Rebecca sitting up in bed holding their baby. "Is everything? Are you?" "We are fine," Rebecca said, her voice hoarse but happy. "Come meet your son." Preston approached slowly, reverently. He looked down at the tiny red-faced baby in awe. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Rebecca, he is perfect. Are you truly all right?" "Exhausted, but yes, I am fine." She smiled up at him. "Would you like to hold him?" Preston took his son carefully, cradling him with surprising confidence for a man who had probably never held a baby before. The infant quieted in his arms, and Preston's face was transformed by wonder and love. "What should we name him?" Rebecca asked. They had discussed names, but nothing had felt quite right. Now, looking at her husband holding their child, Rebecca knew exactly what this boy should be called. "Matthew," she said, "after your father." Preston's eyes shone with tears. "Matthew Young, that sounds right. Hello, Matthew, welcome to the ranch." The next weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Matthew was a healthy baby with a good appetite and strong lungs. Preston was a devoted father, walking the floor with his son at night when Rebecca was too tired, changing nappies without complaint, singing soft lullabies in his deep voice. The ranch work continued, but Preston and Samuel managed between them, with George proving to be a valuable addition. Rebecca recovered her strength slowly, learning the rhythms of motherhood. She had worried briefly that the scars might make nursing difficult, but Matthew had no such concerns and latched on eagerly. On a warm June evening, when Matthew was a month old, Rebecca sat on the porch with her son in her arms while Preston finished the day's work. She looked out over the prairie, at the home they had built together, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost frightening. Preston came to sit beside her, his arm around her shoulders. He kissed her temple and then pressed a gentle kiss to their sleeping son's head. "Happy?" he asked. "More than I ever thought I would be," Rebecca answered honestly. "A year ago, I was hiding in a boarding house, believing I would spend the rest of my life alone. Now I have you and Matthew and this beautiful home. It feels like a dream." "Not a dream, our life. The one we built together." Preston took her free hand and laced their fingers together. "I love you, Rebecca Young. I thank God every day that you answered my advertisement. I love you too. And I thank him that you were the man who placed it." She looked up at him. "Did you really mean it that first day, that you saw only beauty?" "I meant every word. You are the most beautiful woman I have ever known, inside and out. Your scars are part of your story, part of what makes you who you are. They do not diminish you, Rebecca. They show your strength and your courage." Rebecca felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. For 3 years she had believed the scars had ruined her life, had made her unlovable. Preston had shown her the truth. The scars were simply marks on her skin. The real Rebecca, the one who mattered, was unchanged. Matthew stirred in her arms, making small sleeping sounds. Rebecca kissed his downy head and held him close. This child, this perfect little boy, was proof that beauty could come from ashes, that love could grow in the most unexpected places. As the sun set over the Nebraska prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Rebecca Young sat with her husband and their son, and knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The lonely mail-order bride who had arrived in Kearney covered in scars had found something far more valuable than acceptance. She had found love, true and lasting, with a rancher who saw past the surface to the heart beneath. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered, growing steadily under Preston and Rebecca's joint management. Matthew grew into a sturdy, cheerful little boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. 2 years after his birth, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, a tiny girl with auburn curls and a sweet disposition. 3 years after that, another son arrived, James, who inherited his father's quiet nature and his mother's love of books. The house was expanded to accommodate their growing family, with another bedroom added and the storage room converted into a proper nursery. Rebecca planted flower gardens that bloomed in riotous color every summer. Preston built a porch swing where they sat together in the evenings, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set. Rebecca never forgot where she had come from, the pain of those years after the fire when she had believed her life was over. She made it her mission to help others who felt cast out or damaged. She opened her home to women who needed refuge, offering them work at the ranch and a place to heal. She taught reading and arithmetic to the children of neighboring ranches, starting an informal school in her parlor twice a week. Preston supported every endeavor, proud of his wife's generous heart. He treated every person she brought home with the same respect and dignity he had shown Rebecca on that first day. Together, they built not just a ranch but a community of people who had been told they were worthless and learned they were valuable. One autumn afternoon in 1889, 10 years after Matthew's birth, Rebecca stood in her kitchen making preserves while her children did their lessons at the table. Matthew was now 10, already tall and lanky, learning the ranch work beside his father. Grace was 8, sweet and artistic, always drawing or painting. James was 5, still small and shy, happiest with a book in his hands. Preston came in from the barn, stamping dust from his boots. He had turned 40 that year, silver threading through his hair, but he was still strong and vital. He came to Rebecca and kissed her cheek, then ruffled each of the children's hair in turn. "How was the north pasture?" Rebecca asked, stirring the bubbling pot of strawberry preserves. "Good. I think we will have a strong calf crop next spring. Samuel found signs of the fence being damaged though, probably deer. We will need to repair it tomorrow. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her work. There is a dance in town next Saturday. What do you say we go? Mrs. Patterson mentioned it when I was in town yesterday. Rebecca smiled. They tried to go to the town dances several times a year, and Rebecca no longer felt any anxiety about it. The people of Kearney knew her now, respected her for her work in the community and her role on the ranch. Her scars were simply part of her, noticed but unremarked upon. I would like that. It has been a while since we danced together. Can we come too? Grace piped up from the table. Absolutely not, Matthew said with the superior tone of an older brother. It is for adults. You would just get in the way. Matthew Young, do not be rude to your sister, Rebecca said firmly. But yes, Grace, you and your brothers are still a bit young for the town dances, perhaps in a few years. That evening, after the children were in bed, Rebecca and Preston sat on the porch swing as they often did. The night was cool, the stars brilliant in the clear sky. Preston had his arm around her, and Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, comfortable and content. You ever regret it? Preston asked quietly. Leaving Philadelphia, coming out here to marry a stranger, Rebecca looked up at him in surprise. Never, not once. Why would you ask that? I just want to make sure you are happy, that this life is enough for you. Rebecca sat up and turned to face him fully. Preston Young, you gave me everything. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You gave me love when I thought I would never be loved. You gave me children, purpose, a life that matters. How could I possibly regret any of that? Preston smiled and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing the scars on her jaw. After all these years, the gesture still made Rebecca's heart flutter. I am the one who was given everything. You took a chance on a lonely rancher and turned his house into a home. You gave me a family. You make me laugh, you make me think, you make me want to be better. I love you more now than I did 10 years ago, and I will love you more still in another 10 years. Rebecca kissed him softly. I love you too, always. They sat together in the darkness, holding each other, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Inside the house, their children slept safely. Around them, the land they had built together stretched out under the endless Nebraska sky. Rebecca thought back to that terrified woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Kearney 10 years ago, hiding her face and expecting rejection. She had been so certain that her scars defined her, that they made her less than whole. Preston had shown her the truth. Scars were simply proof that she had survived, that she had fought and won. They were not ugly. They were beautiful because they were part of her story, and what a story it was, Rebecca thought with a smile. A mail-order bride covered in scars meets a lonely rancher who sees only beauty. They build a life together, a love story for the ages written not in poetry but in shared work, mutual respect, and genuine affection. They raise children who grow up knowing that worth comes from character, not appearance. They create a home where outcasts and wanderers find acceptance. It was not the life Rebecca had imagined in her youth, but it was infinitely better. It was real and hard and joyful and worth every moment. Years continued to pass in a gentle rhythm. Matthew grew into a fine young man, strong and capable, taking on more responsibility at the ranch. At 18, he was already discussing taking over some of the operation, and Preston was happy to begin sharing the load. Grace, at 16, had become a beautiful young woman despite her protestations that beauty did not matter, and she had her mother's strength of character. She wanted to be a teacher like Rebecca had been, and Rebecca supported her dream wholeheartedly. James, at 13, was quieter than his siblings, but he had a gift with animals that made him invaluable around the ranch. The ranch itself had grown substantially. They now ran over 400 head of cattle and had purchased additional land to the east. Samuel had married and built a house on the property, and his wife Sarah helped Rebecca with the informal school that had grown to include nearly 15 students. George had retired, and they had hired 2 young men to replace him. Rebecca herself was 40 now, with silver beginning to thread through her dark hair. The scars had faded somewhat with time, becoming less angry and red, settling into pale lines. She rarely thought about them anymore except when she caught someone new staring, and then she simply smiled and introduced herself. Most people, she had learned, took their cue from her. If she was comfortable with herself, they were comfortable with her. One spring morning in 1895, Rebecca was working in her garden when a stagecoach rattled up to the ranch house. She stood, brushing dirt from her apron, curious. They were not expecting anyone. A young woman descended from the coach, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and eyes that darted nervously. She kept her head down, her shoulders hunched, and even from a distance Rebecca could see the way she held herself, protective and afraid. Rebecca's heart squeezed with recognition. She had looked like that once. Preston emerged from the barn and greeted the unexpected visitor. Rebecca came to stand beside her husband, and the young woman looked up briefly. Rebecca saw a terrible burn scar covering much of the right side of her face and neck, and understanding flooded through her. "Can we help you, miss?" Preston asked kindly. "I am sorry to intrude," the young woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was told in town that Mrs. Young sometimes helps women who need work. I am looking for a place, somewhere I can earn my keep. I can work hard, I do not eat much, and I will not be any trouble." Rebecca stepped forward and gently took the young woman's hands. "What is your name, Elizabeth?" "Elizabeth Morrison." "Elizabeth, you are very welcome here. We can certainly use help around the ranch, and we have a small cabin that needs occupying. But first, tell me who hurt you." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "My stepfather. When I refused to marry the man he chose for me, he held my face against the stove. I ran away as soon as I could." Preston's face darkened with anger, but his voice remained gentle. "You are safe here, Miss Morrison. No one will hurt you again. You have my word." Rebecca saw Preston's eyes meet hers, and she saw in them the same compassion he had shown her 17 years ago. "Come inside," she said to Elizabeth. "Let me make you some tea and we will talk about what you need." As Rebecca led Elizabeth into the house, she felt the circle completing itself. She had been given love and acceptance when she needed it most. Now she could offer the same to another scarred woman who needed to learn that beauty was not defined by smooth skin. That worth came from the heart, that somewhere in this vast world was a love that would see past surface wounds to the person beneath. Preston followed them inside, and Rebecca watched as he treated Elizabeth with the same careful respect he had shown Rebecca all those years ago. He did not stare, did not pity, simply offered practical help and a safe place to heal. That evening, after Elizabeth had been settled in the small cabin and fed a good meal, Rebecca and Preston sat on their porch swing and watched the sunset. "She reminds me of you," Preston said softly. "That same look in her eyes, like she is waiting for the world to hurt her again." "She does," Rebecca agreed. "I see myself in her. I want to help her find what I found, love and acceptance, and the knowledge that scars do not define us, that we are more than what was done to us." Rebecca leaned her head on Preston's shoulder. "You taught me that, Preston. You looked at me and said you saw only beauty, and you meant it. You changed my life." Preston kissed the top of her head. "You changed mine too, Rebecca. You were never the damaged one. You were the brave one, the strong one. I was the lucky one." They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other across thousands of miles and 17 years, who had built a love story as enduring as the land itself. Inside the house, their children talked and laughed. In the small cabin, a wounded young woman slept peacefully for perhaps the first time in months, safe in the knowledge that she had found sanctuary. And on the prairie, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of growing things and the promise of tomorrow. Rebecca's story was far from over, but it was a good story, one written in love and partnership, and the understanding that true beauty lived in the heart, not the skin. She had come to Nebraska as a scarred mail-order bride expecting nothing but basic kindness. She had found instead a great love, a full life, and the truth that would guide her always. When someone looks at you with love, they see only beauty, because love transforms everything it touches. The years that followed brought more changes, all of them good. Matthew met and married a sweet girl from town named Clara, and they built a house on the western edge of the ranch property. 2 years later, they gave Rebecca and Preston their first grandchild, a daughter they named Rebecca in honor of her grandmother. Rebecca wept when she held her tiny namesake. Overwhelmed by the blessing of seeing her family grow, Grace pursued her dream of teaching and took a position at the school in Kearney. She boarded in town during the week and came home on weekends, always full of stories about her students. At 20, she met a young lawyer named Daniel Winters who saw past her beauty to her brilliant mind, and they fell in love. Their wedding was held at the ranch, a joyful celebration with half the county in attendance. James, true to his quiet nature, stayed on the ranch and became Preston's right hand. He had a gift for breeding cattle and began developing a strain known for hardiness and good temperament. At 19, he was already gaining a reputation in Nebraska ranching circles. Elizabeth Morrison stayed on the ranch, and under Rebecca's gentle guidance, slowly healed. She learned to hold her head high, learned that her worth was not determined by her appearance. 3 years after her arrival, she fell in love with Samuel's younger brother who came to visit for the summer. He saw her scars and called her the most beautiful woman he had ever met, and Rebecca smiled through tears of joy at their wedding. The informal school that had started in Rebecca's parlor grew into a proper building, funded by contributions from local ranchers. Rebecca taught there 3 days a week, sharing her love of learning with children from across the county. She made a point of teaching her students that character mattered far more than appearance, that kindness and courage were the truest forms of beauty. By 1905, Preston was 58 and Rebecca was 51. They had been married for 27 years, and their love had only deepened with time. The ranch was now run primarily by Matthew and James, though Preston still worked every day, unable to imagine simply sitting idle. Rebecca had finally talked him into hiring a foreman to handle the day-to-day operations so he could slow down a bit. They now had 6 grandchildren, with a 7th on the way. The ranch house was always full of noise and laughter when the family gathered, which was often. Rebecca loved cooking big meals and watching her children and grandchildren fill the rooms where she and Preston had once sat so carefully and formally on their wedding night. One evening in late summer, Rebecca and Preston took a long walk across the prairie, something they did often now that they had more free time. They walked hand in hand, comfortable in the silence that comes from years of companionship. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and the grass rippled like water in the breeze. "You remember the first time we walked out here together?" Rebecca asked. "Right after I arrived, you were showing me the ranch boundaries. I remember, you were so quiet, so careful. I could tell you were waiting for me to reject you. I was terrified, Every moment of those first few days, I expected you to tell me there had been a mistake, that you could not possibly want someone who looked like me." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "I did not understand yet that you were nothing like the small-minded people I had known before." Preston stopped walking and turned to face her. The setting sun illuminated his weathered face, highlighting the lines that years of outdoor work had etched there. He was still handsome to her, still the man who had given her back her life. "Rebecca Young, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Marrying you was the smartest decision I ever made. These 27 years have been the happiest of my life." Rebecca smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes even after all these years. "Mine too. You know, sometimes I still cannot quite believe this is real, that I get to have this life, this love. There were years when I thought I would never smile again, never feel joy. You gave me all of that back." "We gave it to each other," Preston corrected gently. He reached up and traced the scars on her face, a gesture that had become almost automatic over the years. "These scars tell a story of courage and sacrifice. They saved children. They brought you to me. I would not change a single thing about you." They stood together on the prairie as the sun dipped below the horizon, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful. Behind them, the ranch sprawled across the land, a testament to hard work and partnership. Ahead of them, whatever years remained would be spent together, as they had spent every day since Rebecca stepped off that stagecoach in 1878. Preston pulled Rebecca into his arms and held her close. She rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling safe and cherished and loved beyond measure. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and steady. "I love you," Preston said softly. "I love you too," Rebecca replied. "Always and forever." They walked back to the house hand in hand as the stars began to emerge. Inside, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. Their home, their life, their love story. Rebecca Watson had arrived in Kearney, Nebraska as a scarred mail-order bride, expecting little and hoping for basic kindness. She had found instead a man who looked at her and saw only beauty, who gave her a love that transformed her understanding of herself. Together, they had built a family, a ranch, a legacy that would continue for generations. The scars remained, faded now but still visible. But they no longer defined Rebecca. They were simply part of her history, markers of her journey from despair to joy. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw a ruined face. She saw the woman Preston Young had seen from the very beginning, someone beautiful, courageous, and worthy of love. And every day, as she watched the sun rise over the Nebraska prairie, Rebecca thanked God for that advertisement in the Philadelphia newspaper, for a lonely rancher seeking a wife, for the courage to answer, and for the love that had saved them both. Their story was one for the ages, told and retold by their children and grandchildren. The mail-order bride covered in scars, and the rancher who saw only beauty. It became a family legend, a reminder that true love sees with the heart, not the eyes, and that the most beautiful things in life are often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone with wisdom and compassion to discover them. Preston and Rebecca Young lived out their days on the ranch they had built together, surrounded by family and love. They died within months of each other in 1918, Preston at 71 and Rebecca at 65, their hands clasped together even in death. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, where the prairie grass grew tall and the wind whispered eternal songs. Their children ensured that the ranch remained in the family, passing it down through the generations. The house was preserved and expanded, but the original rooms where Preston and Rebecca had begun their life together were kept intact, a shrine to a love that had defied expectations and endured through decades. The story of the mail-order bride and the rancher who saw only beauty was told to each new generation, a reminder that real love transcends physical appearance, that courage and character are the truest forms of beauty, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a leap of faith and a willingness to see what others miss. Rebecca Watson Young had lived a full and beautiful life, not despite her scars but because of them. They had brought her to Preston, to Nebraska, to a life she never could have imagined. And in the end, that was the greatest gift of all. The knowledge that what the world had called damage was actually the path to everything she had ever needed. Preston had kept his word from that very first day. He had looked at Rebecca's scars and seen only beauty. And in doing so, he had taught her to see her own beauty, to understand that she was more than her wounds, that love was not about perfection, but about acceptance and commitment, and choosing each other every single day. Their love story lived on in the ranch that still bore the Young name, in the descendants who carried their legacy, in the stories told around dinner tables and beside evening fires. It lived on in every scarred person who heard the tale and found hope, in every lonely heart that discovered love was possible even when circumstances seemed impossible. The mail-order bride arrived covered in scars. The lonely rancher said he saw only beauty. And together, they created something beautiful that would last far beyond their own years, a testament to the power of love to heal, transform, and endure.